Hello, everybody. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Welcome to the panel, The Emotional Life of Populism, Israeli and German Perspectives. My name is Eva, I'm the curatorial head of the arts program, and together with my colleague Vandenberg, who is sitting over there and will moderate the panel, we initiated this event several months ago. And today, given the political situation we are in right now, we are even more grateful for it to happen. A very warm welcome to all of you and to our panelists, Professor Dr. Eva Illouz and Professor Dr. Koschut. Nice to have you here with us tonight. Before I introduce the panelists and the moderator, I would like to say a few words about the frame of this event. Some of you might have heard it already in the introduction I gave in the white box. So the panel takes place within the framework of the annual theme Being Wrong, a program of the arts program at the Center of Cultural Production of Zeppelin University. And we have been discussing this topic in various constellations for almost a year now, and I want to say a few words about it. The annual theme refers to the fundamental, existential, cultural, and almost ontological dimension of being wrong. The feeling of belonging to a dysfunctional culture, of being in the wrong skin, of being systematically wrong because of the body, the culture, the milieu one inhabits. It refers to a possible knowledge of holding a certain position within a violent system. These feelings, knowledges, and embodied experiences are not just about harmless mistakes or small errors that could easily be excused. Being wrong means that the system, the structure, the thinking or acting as a whole is fundamentally disturbed. And the question we would like to discuss is whether this also applies for a certain form of democracies and in what way. A question we ask ourselves in the face of the rise of right-wing, populist and anti-democratic thoughts and movements, and the racist and anti-Semitic acts of violence related to them, that we can see arising in so many forms these days. The arts program in fall and winter aims to address the question of being wrong by focusing on the grammar, the practices and conditions that underlie racist and populist thought, authoritarianism and provoke violent and social divisions. Very central within the program is the exhibition White Face by a South African artist, Candice Price, a video installation that examines the workings of white supremacy, running since September 2023 in the White Box. Some of you have seen it this evening, and it will be open also after the event, and you can visit it. This exhibition, as well as in lectures, talks, teaching, and a final symposium in November, and with this panel today, we aim to explore the connecting lines between fears of social decline, the loss of privileges, loss of future, resentments, radicalization, and speaking with Eva here, phantasmatic ideas of ownership. So Eva Illous' recent book, The Emotional Life of Populism, which will be one focus of today's panel, was very influential for us when we set up this program, since it analyzes how fear, resentment, disgust, and love are the emotions from which actually populist ideology and authoritarianism emerge. How and to what extent will be part of the following conversation. Present with us here tonight is also Simon Koschut, a political scientist and expert on security policy, whose research focuses on the significance of emotions for political radicalization. Given the background, we are incredibly grateful for this conversation is taking place today, since both of our panelists, Eva as well as Simon, have been researching the emotional grammar and emotional politics of contemporary societies for years. Eva Illouz is a professor of sociology. She is director of studies at how I just learned, EHESS, School for Advanced Studies in Paris. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Yeah. Her research and teaching focuses on emotions, culture, and capitalism, in particular, cultural aspects of the intersection of emotion and communication and capitalism. The award-winning sociologist and emotional theorist, who is author of, I think, 14 books translated in 25 languages, has become known for her work on love in times of consumerism, capitalism, and the internet. I think most of you know her books. Several of her major works are Consuming the Romantic Utopia, Love, and the Cultural Contradiction of Capitalism, Cold Intimacies, The Making of Emotional Capitalism, Why Love Hurts, A Sociological Explanation, Unloving, A Sociology of Negative Relations. For many years, he is one of the leading intellectuals analyzing and commenting on political developments and events in Israel. In 2015, the volume Israel was published, a collection of essays in which Eva Illouz draws a picture of Israeli society based on current political development and personal experiences. Illouz latest study, The Emotional Life of Populism, published in 2023, so this year, in English and German, analyzes how fear, disgust, resentment, and love undermine democracy, and shows how these four emotions, and I think we will discuss that in full in a little bit, nourish and underpins the rise and persistence of populism both in Israel and in many other countries around the world. Today she is talking about her findings and their applicability to other contemporary regimes with the holder of the DFG-Heisenberg-Professorship for International Security Policy at Zeppelin University, Professor Dr. Koschut, who conducts research with qualitative data and case analysis on the theory and practice of international conflicts and on the role and function of international organizations. In his research project, Emotional Communities and World Politics, he investigates the importance of emotions for resolving intra-institutional conflict and for maintaining social order in international politics, and examines how emotions, morality, and norms are related. He co-edits, among other things, the interdisciplinary publication series Emotionen in Politik und Gesellschaften, Emotions in Politics and Societies, which deals with the meaning of emotions in political and social contexts. Thank you, Eva Illouz and Simon Koschut, for being here, for making time for public exchange and discussion within the very challenging political circumstances today. The devastating attacks of October 7th and the consecutive war in Israel and Gaza undoubtedly put this panel into a very different horizon of thought, given the very different urgency, and might charge this gathering emotionally in unexpected ways, while acknowledging that what we will be discussed tonight will resonate with the current catastrophic political moment. We proposed and want to keep the focus on the originally planned theme of tonight's panel, the discussion of the role of emotion for the rise of violent right-wing populist politics. We want to talk about the complex drama of those emotions that drive this global rise of anti-democratic movements in order to understand and hopefully in order to oppose them. The talk is moderated by my colleague, Professor Dr. who is an art historian, professor of art theory and curating at Zeppelin University, academic head of the arts program, and who works on arts activism and politics since many years, and to whom I'm handing over now in order to open and guide the conversation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, for this introduction. As I already heard from Eva, she said it would take a while for her to get into this conversation on the topic we had agreed upon. And I tried to give her some hints how to do that. We sit here together at a most disturbing time. a time when we need to rethink many of our beliefs and maybe also resituate ourselves in the world. Bitter disappointments, insecurity, anger, unrestrained violence, cynical inhumanity, fear and hatred determine the global political climate these days. In such a time, however, it is more important than ever to find words again. Not to position ourselves in the self-righteous opinion and statement market, but to seek explanations and listen to each other. Therefore, I think it is a great privilege to be able to be here today with two esteemed colleagues to talk about a topic in an analytical way, a topic that is increasingly worrying. Under the title The Emotional Life of Populism, German and Israeli Perspectives, we try to look at a matrix that leads to hatred, radicalism, racism, and anti-Semitism. We will speak about the emotions which are behind the rise of right-wing populism, anti-democratic and democratic despising tendencies, and ultimately lead to violence and hatred, and, as we see, war. And I am here today with two experts who have been analyzing these developments for years and trying to explain them by looking at the emotional matrix behind it. Therefore, I'm extremely grateful that we can be here today at this, by no means, and it is by no means a matter of course that we can be here in this way. Many panel discussions and debates have been cancelled recent days. Partly because people couldn't leave their countries, but mainly also because we are surrounded by a hatred climate, a climate of fear, anger, indignation, but also of silence and self-censorship. Candice Price, the artist who is exhibiting here at Zeppelin University, has prepared a symposium on German memory culture and the relation between anti-Semitism and racism, together with the literary scholar Michael Rothberg, and the Federal Agency of Civic Education, Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, under the title We Still Need to Talk, referring to the documentary We Need to Talk. This symposium was cancelled a few days ago by the Federal Agency of Civic Education. This happened on the ground that in the current situation, as they say, the Federal Agency does not see itself in a position to conduct and moderate this debate constructively in order to achieve the intended educational goal in a factual and respectful manner. So that's how they argue. We, however, believe in the current situation, debates that address anti-Semitism, racism, violent forms of populism, hostility to democracy, and religious fanatism are more important than ever. The occasion for this event was our annual topic, Being Wrong, as Rahul just said, which we organized with the street magazine Arts of the Working Class and Eva Illouz, and one important thing was also Eva Illouz's books, Emotional Life of Populism, published in the summer, and the fact that Simon Koschut is researching a similar topic. Both will now present their central thoughts and theses in a short statement of about 8 to 10 minutes. Then we will talk with each other, and then also the panel will open for the discussion for everyone. And we start with a statement by Eva.
Thank you so much. So I I don't always do what I'm asked to do, so I'm not going to actually really introduce the book. Maybe I can talk about it during the discussion, but I'm going to talk a little bit beside the book. From 1970 to 2010, there was an extraordinary rate of countries which joined the regime of democracy. In 2016, there were 96 electoral democracies in the world. In 2022, there were only 90. Liberal democracies went from 44 in 2009 to 32 in 2022, just a decade later. And the number of people that have democratic rights has also very much plummeted. Between 2016 and 2022, it fell from almost 4 billion people to 2.3 billion people. So obviously democracy is under the assault of what Francis Fukuyama calls nationalist populism, which is, in my opinion, a political form whose characteristic is to undermine the institutions of democracy from within. It disguises itself as democracy or as an ultra-democratic discourse, but is actually a way of undermining democracy from inside. In fact, as political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zilblatt claim, democracies die not only through military coups or other such dramatic events, they also die slowly. And populism is one political form taken by this slow death. That's my first remark. It's just a bunch of remarks, that's it. Second, my second remark is that we live in the midst of what Yascha Mounk, the political theorist, has called a great experiment. Never before have democratic societies, or maybe any society, but definitely democratic societies, lived in such multicultural and multi-ethnic societies. In Great Britain, I think 25 years ago, or 30 years ago, no, in the 1970s, less than 1 person out of 25 was born outside of the UK. Today it is 1 out of 7. A few decades ago, Sweden was one of the most homogeneous countries in the world. Today, 1 inhabitant out of 5 has foreign origins, and a lot of countries have undergone the same change. No democracy planned on this change. That's the point. No democracy became consciously multi-ethnic and multi-confessional. But all of these countries found themselves with a large population of immigrants of ethnicity or religion different from that of the majority. It could well be that populism is a reaction to this fact which was not planned consciously by democracies. And it is, I think, in my opinion, it is an attempt to change the relationship between majority and the groups living in their midst. It is mostly, I think, an attempt by the majority to reassert forcefully its well, not exactly rights, because it has rights, but to assert its power and domination over the minorities. Third remark, don't worry, I have only 5. Socialism, communism, democracy, and populism are all supposed to represent the people. But of each one of these doctrines is drastically different from each other, and yet they're supposed to represent the same thing. So if that is the case, either only one of them says the truth and all the others lie, or perhaps more disturbingly, all of them actually, or none of them, tell the truth, and none of them really represents the people. This is connected to something else, which is that the word people that everybody claims has become really an empty signifier, an empty category, whose invocation serves to legitimize whatever political orientation you may have, in fact, from the right or from the left. So this is only to say, perhaps this means we should really think of politics, and even democratic politics, by putting on the side for a while the notion of the people, which has become too empty, in my opinion, to be really used usefully. The fourth proposition is that while deliberative democracy has always been based on the assumption of rationality, a double rationality, in the sense that voters know what they want and they vote according to their interests. That's one assumption of rationality, that the citizen is rational and makes decisions based on information and interest. And now it is easy for us to imagine how information is false or incomplete. Today with fake news, nobody would have difficulties understanding that. It's more difficult actually to envisage the possibility that citizens may well be oblivious, in fact, or at least more oblivious than we had assumed, to their self-interest, understood mostly as economic self-interest. This is, by the way, the departure point of my book, which is precisely this reckoning with the fact that possibly, in fact, citizens either don't know their interest or have powerful identity interests that totally conflict and even supersede their economic interest. So Berlusconi, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Trump, or Netanyahu, to take just a few glorious examples, did not in any way contribute to the economic health of their voters. In fact, the opposite, yet they retained their fierce loyalty despite their miserable failures. So rationality, so in that sense, you know, that's one sense of rationality that seems to me quite put into question. And second is that rationality also pertains to the rule of disagreement in democracy, rules which assume not only that wrong opinions will be eliminated, but also that we can debate rationally about issues and reach a consensus around the best solution in the public sphere. When we look at the ways in which Berlusconi, Netanyahu, Trump systematically lied and manipulate this public opinion, and yet have retained their status, credibility, and standing, we're forced to observe that this proposition, hypothesis of rationality as being at the cornerstone of democracy may not be any longer valid. And thus, it could well be that in contradistinction to what we commonly assume, possibly, I'm just raising here something that I find as disturbing as you may, a great deal of people may not be that interested in democracy after all. Maybe not. Maybe they're not interested in democracy because actually democracy doesn't work for them. It actually works for some, it doesn't work for others. Maybe it works very well for the middle or upper middle class and not so much for the other groups. And maybe it's also because they don't really know what they do. when they choose for leaders like Orban or Netanyahu or Erdogan. And finally, another possibility is that in the end, maybe the affirmation of a group's identity, of the nation untainted past, of one's ethnic uniqueness, seem to have re-emerged as perhaps more important, at least for a significant part of the public, than democracy per se. And so it seems that what is behind populism is that what people mean today by democracy, the power by and for the people, is that in fact it should be only for one people, and that there is a great struggle over the meaning, over democracy, precisely because an increasing amount of people want it to be only for them. And so, just to finish this introduction on populism, I like the image that Jan Werner Müller, who is a prominent world specialist on populism, has offered, where he suggests that populism is a permanent, shadowy effect of representative democracy. In other words, it accompanies democracy and is not outside of it.
Thank you. We continue with Simon.
Yes, thank you so much. When I just entered the bookstore this afternoon, I saw the title of the new Spiegel, one of the leading German magazines, which is Fear. The bottom line, the baseline is the basic argument being that Jews have to feel afraid again, not just in Germany, but elsewhere too. So I think this is a very fitting time to have this discussion about populism, not just in Germany, Israel, but any place in the world. And really like to emphasize how glad I am that Eva is joining us today here in this discussion. So what I wanted to do here in my brief talk is to talk a little about democratic emotions. Because when I read the book by Eva, which I highly recommend you to read as well, she makes this brilliant argument about three types of undemocratic emotions that are prevalent in Israeli society. So I wanted to sort of ask myself, so what could democratic emotions really look like? So what's the emotional underpinning of liberal democratic societies? Because as you rightly mentioned, we usually tend to think of democracy as deliberative, as something rational, as opposed to autocratic rulers who are just employing emotions, and emotions, of course, being the radical other of deliberative democracy and rationalism. But as we also learn from neuroscience and psychology research, is the fact that rationality is impossible without emotions, that rationality actually requires both cognitive and emotional input. And if we take that notion seriously, and there's no reason not to do that, that means that democracy requires emotions as well. So it's not just about deliberation and cognitive input, but it's also about, or very much about, the emotional underpinnings that democracy as a community of liberals comes into being. And so when I speak about democratic emotions, I mean emotions and feelings that are associated with liberal values, principles, and processes. So in liberal societies, for example, emotions like hope, trust, empathy, and a sense of empowerment can be considered democratic emotions. Not saying they're the only ones. I'll get to that at the end of my talk. But they're quite crucial to a functioning democratic society because, for example, hope is a key ingredient for democracy because it induces a feeling of that there is a possibility for positive change, that things can get better, giving people voices and votes to make it, and feeling to make a difference. Now, of course, we know that not every vote counts and not every vote makes a difference, but it's the feeling that counts. The emotional feeling that my vote can make a difference, because in illiberal societies, it cannot. The second democratic emotions I wanted to briefly touch on is trust. And here, by trust, I mean the trust in the functioning of democratic institutions, in the government and electoral processes, which is quite crucial for democracies. And this trust is eroding in many liberal societies these days. And this is, of course, a big threat to functioning democratic systems. Also, empathy. I will touch upon this briefly later as well. But empathy, I cannot empathize how much empathy matters for the functioning of democratic societies. Simply because by empathy, I don't mean that we have to agree with each other and that we have to sort of feel with each other in the necessary sense. This is emotional empathy. It would be fantastic to have that, but I agree that I see that this is not possible in every way. But at least understanding the feelings of others and respecting the feelings of others to foster a sense of solidarity and cooperation among citizens, liberal citizens, I think is quite crucial. Finally, empowerment, the feeling a sense of agency that people in liberal societies have, which people in illiberal societies don't have. That the individual has the power to influence governments, decisions, and policies. So just stepping back briefly, when I talk about liberalism, I don't mean liberalism as a static, universal concept, because liberalism is not just liberalism. Liberalism is a historical and culturally specific narrative that binds individuals together through various connections. And so I'm not so much interested in what liberal democracy actually is, but when and how it comes into being. And my argument is that emotions are quite crucial to that evolution of liberal democratic societies. So in this sense, emotions can be seen as valid moral judgments that are socially constructed, shaping the identity of liberal communities. And here I should briefly define what I mean by the social construction of emotions, because I usually get this whenever I talk about emotions. So what do you mean by emotions? And I think it's a fair question to say, because this is what basically everyone doing research on emotion has to answer. So basically, when I talk about emotions, I see emotions as social categories, as something that is inherently social. The feeling may be individually felt, but the emotion is a social category. Take anger, for example. If you're saying I'm angry, and if I say I'm angry, we may not necessarily mean the same thing. We talk about anger, we know what we mean by that category, but the feeling I have when I say I'm angry, the feeling you have when you say you're angry might be totally different. Not just the intensity, but the entire feeling itself may be totally different. But we agree on that we are both angry. This makes the emotion of anger a social category, a social construction. So it doesn't mean that emotions are not real. It means that they're felt individually, but come into being through social practice, through language, through social expressions, rituals, practices, etc. And so emotions are, when I talk about emotions, I mean emotions as a product of sociocultural knowledge, as something that is embedded and seeps into the social fabric of society, and incredibly shapes the social fabric of society. And so when I mean that emotions are the foundation of liberal democracy, I mean that liberal democracies have a specific idea of what kind of emotions are appropriate in their society. So what emotions are appropriately expressed in what way, and which are not appropriate, inappropriate, and should not be expressed. So for example, hatred or inappropriate anger towards other liberals. And this also brings me to the influence, to the importance of the cultural politics of emotions. So emotions, as I just said, are not just rooted in individual feelings, they are deeply linked to culture, to democratic culture, more specific. So emotion cultures are structures of feelings, sets of rules and beliefs about feelings and how they should be expressed and by whom they should be expressed. And this is how we help create political communities. This is how they bring into being liberal democratic societies. And because when people connect with a democratic culture emotionally, when they become emotionally attached to liberal values, this marginalizes and eclipses other ideas and beliefs, most notably illiberal ideas and beliefs. And just a final point, which I noted earlier, the role of anger in democratic societies, because we usually tend to be very hesitant to endorse any kind of anger expressions. And this is not just an everyday mode, but also even scholars, a lot of scholars operate under the implicit assumption that anger should be viewed as a destructive emotion. It should be thus generally avoided in liberal societies because it facilitates aggression and intergroup violence. So I have a quote from this Stoic philosopher Seneca, who described anger as the most hideous and frenzious of all emotions. The other emotions have in them some element of peace and calm, while this one, anger, is wholly violent. And this is not just Seneca speaking here 1,000 years ago. Building on this tradition, we have philosophers like Martha Nussbaum, who has suggested that anger should have no place in modern societies and should be replaced with civic love. And I'm not so sure about that, because I don't believe that in democratic societies we necessarily should love all of us should love each other. At the very least, we should empathize with the feelings of each other. So in other words, respect and understand the feelings of others, not necessarily love each other. But even anger can be sometimes quite elementary to liberal society. The starting point being the impression that anger being expressed is an expression that something is wrong, that someone is being wronged, and something is not right. And this is perhaps something that is actually quite crucial when we talk about, Eva mentioned, the creeping erosion and undermining of democratic liberal societies. And anger, I think, can be a source of empowerment to fix this. Because anger expresses a desire to fix what's wrong and to make things right. And in these cases, I would argue, anger can actually lead to the reinvigoration of democratic culture rather than its demise. And this is actually framed, so I'm not saying that anger should not be controlled in any way, because uncontrolled anger can very much lead to violence. However, I would like to emphasize here that there are times when anger, righteous and justifiable anger, helps stabilizing democratic culture. What I mean by righteous and stable, justifiable anger? To become justifiably angry means not to express individual anger, but to become angry on behalf of a group, because other emotional expressions of other people are threatening the moral order of that group, not just the ideals and beliefs of individuals. And so I argue that in some situations, the right kind of anger can be a good thing, a civic virtue in liberal democratic society. In Germany, for example, this fact is captured in the concept of wehrhafte Demokratie, which translates to defensive democracy, which is very much based on anger. It refers to a concept and approach to democracy that places an emphasis on actively defending democratic values and institutions against their illiberal forces, including those that may seek to undermine and overthrow democratic systems. And with that, I guess I'll leave it to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you to both of you for these statements that went into a surprising direction. But let me start by connecting to your short input, Simon. You brought up empathy as one of the emotions that belong to democracy. And I was a little bit let's say, triggered by this, because I would say that populists, like for example Donald Trump, his whole policy and his whole acting is based on empathy and resonance. So why would you then argue this is a democratic emotion, or would you say that this way of populism and working with post-truth and so on and so forth, would you say this belongs to democracy? This belongs to the inner field of democracy because it's based on empathy?
Right. Right, that's a very good point, because empathy in and of itself is not something positive and something, it's actually a neutral concept and that can be used in both ways. So you can use empathy, even the torturer in the Syrian prison needs empathy to punish and torture his victim. Okay? So empathy is not something good in and of itself. But what I would argue is that empathy, at least the idea of connecting with the feelings of others, is inherent, is especially important in democratic societies, because if we sort of, this is what I find problematic in the whole notion of polarization we see in society, that we don't even accept that other people have a right to feel something. Okay, so we tend to sort of downplay or even ridicule the feelings of others, or not even wanting to hear the feelings of others. And this is why I think empathy is an important ingredient. It's not sort of the magic formula to peace and democracy, but it's a central requirement to connect with the feelings of others in any group, not just democracies, in order to build a feeling of solidarity among citizens.
Yeah, maybe I have a question to both of you. You both work on emotions in politics, and how would you say, what's the advantage to approach politics through the term of, or the category of emotions? What can this approach show that cannot be shown through the polarization theory and the theory which is more economical approach of the people who left behind, or people who do not see their values represented in the society anymore? So what's the advantage to approach the current political situation through the category of emotions?
Well, first let me just be clear that I don't think this approach is superior to any other. I think that, for me, emotions are embedded in narratives. You don't feel emotions if you don't tell yourself a story. And it is the story, so to speak, that organizes the emotion for you, and the emotion that organizes the story. So if you don't like the fact that there are immigrants, then you are going to tell lots of stories about the ways in which immigrants actually cheat or actually threaten your cultural identity. You're going to have a lot of stories like that. So, one of the things, one advantage, if you want, in focusing on emotions, it is to understand the kind of imaginary landscape that people live in, that we all live in fact. When we approach politics, I don't think politics is only a series of facts and opinions based on facts. It is constituted by, as I said, imaginary landscapes. These imaginary landscapes have have as their mountains and valleys, if you want, and words, key emotions and key narratives. How you tell yourself that the world around you is like. Then I think an emotion really is about, I mean, Simon was talking before about his definition of an emotion. For me, what characterizes an emotion is that it is a kind of signal to myself and to others of where I stand in the world. So if I feel humiliated or proud, let's say, being humiliated or proud is a statement of where I am right now in the world. So if you approach politics through emotions, I think it gives you a sense of how people feel in their social world. What is their sense of position in that social world? Do they feel vengeful? Do they feel humiliated? What are the stories and the lies that they tell themselves? So to focus on emotion is not to be afraid to confront the fact that people may very well, in fact, probably most of the time, lie to themselves and tell stories in order to that reflect these lies that they tell to themselves. And so, for me, the advantage of focusing on emotions is to examine this kind of displacement of consciousness. How you, in politics, in a way, maybe this would correspond to a Freudian, even though not Freudian, but a Freudian description of the psyche. But you're always missing. There is something in politics in which you're always missing the real object. So when to take the example of Israel, where there has been, before this horrible war, where there was a very intense ethnic struggle between Jews of Arab origins and Jews of European origins, and the solid, I think, the solidity of the right rested on the story of discrimination that these Jews of Arab origins had undergone. The story is both real and false in a way. It becomes a part of their imaginary, it becomes the ways in which they define their identity. And then they start hating the left, they start hating anything that stands for the left by association. You see, because this is once your psyche is engaged in a kind of emotional chain, then association becomes the main way of thinking. And so there is something true, and there is something of the order of the lie, there is something of the order of the imaginary, and it's this kind of false causal chains that emotions help explain. How come? Because if you're so angry and so resentful, then you will indeed come to profoundly distort the democratic process.
Yeah, relating to the term anger again, which brought up as a necessary term in politics, and I totally understand that. I think of protest movements and so on and so on. But you are also a specialist on security policy, and I would be interested in how you explain how anger then turns into radicalization and even self-sacrificing religious radicalization. So how does this take place, and what is at work there? Which kind of stories, which kind of conditions are behind this kind of transformation dynamic?
Right. thanks. I think just to add to the first question, I did some research on emotions in NATO, and when I interviewed some of the people working there, one of them actually answered your question just perfectly. She said that NATO is an emotional institution because it is run by people. Because it is run by people. And that's just a simple fact. So it's not an advantage or disadvantage, it's just a fact of life that politics involves emotions, because we're not robots, right? We have feelings, and politics obviously involves feelings. But to come to your question about the role of anger and how it shapes radicalism and maybe to violence, I already sort of hinted to the fact that anger is a very ambivalent emotion. So it can go either way, right? So anger can be, I can be angry with my wife, right? But doesn't mean that I sort of will leave her. So anger can actually be a sign of caring. Anger meaning I care about the other person. If I'm not angry, I don't care about the other person, right? But it can also be a sign that I don't care less, in the sense that I don't like the other person. So it really becomes quite crucial, as you already said, to include the narratives and the cultural framework within which that anger is shaped and channeled. And some research I did on the anger and shame, both in combination of the kamikaze pilots in Imperial Japan during World War II, you could really see, and I did research on this because they have the diaries, they kept the diaries of these pilots, so their emotions are quite accessible compared to, not perfect, but compared to other cases. And you could really see how the anger that they had before they entered the military towards the state and state repression and all that was sort of channeled in a different direction towards anger against Japan's perceived enemies and so on. And so I think this sort of channeling of anger in certain directions is done by a cultural framework, by cultural narratives. And this is one thing that populists do very good. They create scapegoat. They say your anger is not your fault. Right? It's their fault. You should be angry at them, not them. And this is a sort of hideous sort of strategy that they sort of channel anger in the direction that they prefer.
You both also wrote on collective memories. In your books there are a lot of interviews as well, and a lot of stories about national trauma in Israel. So what role do collective memories play in the rise of populism and also in the development of anti-democratic developments?
Did I write collective memory?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm glad to know it. I would make a distinction first between history and memory. History hopefully is what happened, the facts, assuming we can have access to them. Memory, I think, is what a group chooses to ignore and forget about certain facts and what it chooses to remember in order to build a coherent narrative about who it is and why it is the way it is. That's how I would define memory. And memory plays a crucial role, I think, in giving voice to the present. Actually, I think that, so when Putin, for example, connects back to not the Soviet Union, but or not only but to Imperial Russia, he's doing it to assign a kind of new political goal and identity to Russia. In Israel, memory has been everything. in a way, I think. So the Israeli wanted to be a new man, more secondarily women, and that meant maybe erasing the memory of what he was before the birth of the Jewish nation. But in fact, he was not able to at all. The opposite was true. He rebuilt, he built two memories, I think, two set of memories, which at some point connected. One was the memory of the persecutions and expulsions in mostly European, but also Islamic lands, as a way also to justify, constantly justify and legitimize Jewish nationalism. And also, the second set of memory, which, the first narrative at some point had, of course, as its acme is the Shoah. The Shoah became this kind of black hole, this kind of, the end of the narrative, and almost the end beyond which you can no longer think. It is the kind of super-narrative that swallows all the others, and that makes it almost impossible to think beyond it. And then there was the narrative of the conflict with the local natives, with which they had to confront themselves in, a long war that involved also the British powers. And at some point, I think it happened in the I'm not sure exactly, I think it happened maybe late 50s, but more decisively in the 1960s, after the Eichmann trial. At some point, the two memories coalesced and connected to each other. And now, with the horrific events that have happened, I think that what has happened was that these two set of memories, of the struggle against the Arabs and the struggle of the Jews, struggle is not exactly with Europe and Islam, or their persecutions. I think now the two set of memories form only one. You no longer have two narratives, you have only one narrative, and the Hamas is now, it is now replaced by the Nazi in the sense that the Hamas is the new Nazi. And so this will make it much more difficult, I think, for this set of memory to re-enter the area of politics. I think one set of memory is almost outside the realm of the political, and one set of memory was entirely political. We gave them this, they said no. 5 times we gave them a state, and 5 times they say no. That is the realm of the political. But now I think the Hamas and part of the Palestinians left that realm in the collective memory that might be shaped in Israel. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe you didn't, I'm sure you didn't use the term if you say you didn't, but I felt that in the book trauma and also how to deal with trauma in politics played a very important role. And maybe I want to ask you the same question. What do you think, what's the role of trauma and also the reuse of pointing to the trigger points of some national trauma in radicalization, and when do people use trauma for politics, like pointing back to ancient times, like several hundred years ago or even to the prehistorical times and arguing on this point. For me, it's interesting, why do we see this rise of populism now? And why do a lot of populist leaders and autocrats use this trauma in politics now? Or is this a phenomenon which is not new?
I'm not sure if trauma really is a sort of prerequisite for populism, or that populism sort of needs trauma to exist. Should certainly instrumentalize it, that's for sure. But collective trauma is something that is quite crucial in shaping the emotions in a society. And this requires political input, you're right about that. Because what is a trauma? Trauma is a disruption of a sort of direct or clear path forward, right? So the world is no longer as it is. The world no longer makes sense. People are speechless about what happened. This is what we literally hear from people who have witnessed the atrocities by Hamas and others. So this is something that we can call a collective trauma for Israel, obviously. The question then becomes, how do we turn this silence, this speechlessness into words, into emotions? How do we sort of channel these sort of feelings that come with the trauma? This paralysis, this lack of agency. And this is where populism, of course, comes in. So politicians obviously try to make sense of this, of what happened. And this is what something you can witness in many types of trauma. For example, a terrorist attack works the same way. So when there's a terrorist attack, you see state leaders trying to reassure their people that the state is sort of still there, it's still powerful, we can still protect them, etc. And this is what we see in Israel today as well, and Netanyahu doing exactly that. And sort of playing on the strength in a situation of trauma is, I think, one of the strategies that the populist leaders use in order to regain momentum and to sort of shape popular opinion about what happened.
Yeah, maybe one last question for the open, so the question to the public, or the discussion to the public. Again, I want to come back to my question, how do we explain the enormous rise of right-wing populism these days, worldwide? We started with the statement saying the downgrade, telling about the downgrading of democracy. And on the first pages of your book, you quote Adorno and his aspects of new right-wing radicalism, who says that fascism is a social pathology that is part of every democratic society. One reason Adorno gives for this is the social mobility that is integral, an integral aspect of every democratic society. This social mobility, in turn, is accompanied by a fear of relegation and loss of status, or privileges even. And these fears of relegation lead to a sense of loss of privilege and loss to a desire to maintain and defend one's privileges. Adorno already argued that this defensive attitude gives rise to resentment and ultimately to fascist politics. How current is this phenomenon? Why is it that right now the rise of right-wing populists and fascists can be observed worldwide?
I mean, worldwide is too broad. I'm not sure I can answer it. So I would say, I mean, there are roughly two categories of explanation. One would look at the voters. And if you look at the voters, they include, they tap into a fundamental divide that exists today, the divide between the educated and the non-educated. And within the educated, if you look at the United States, within the educated even, there is a divide that didn't used to be as sharp as it is today between the Ivy Leaguers, those who go to the best, to attend top, and those who go to the middle range, in terms of the kind of jobs they get later. I mean, the Ivy Leaguers can be sure that they are the ones who will, be the CEOs, get the 6 figures, 7 figures salaries, and so on and so forth, whereas the path to social mobility of those who attend the more middle-rank universities is much more limited and constrained. So one is the convertibility of diploma has very much changed. But people have a diploma, they have a degree, and then they see that the degree they get, and it's sometimes even a working class kid who miraculously gets into Harvard sees afterwards that his chances are much, much less than the person whose grandfather already went to Harvard. Okay. So that's one thing, which is very simply meritocracy, the meritocratic ethos of democracy not only did not deliver, but got worse. The wealth has, the wealth of the wealthiest has doubled, tripled, quadrupled in the last decade. So, if I wanted to be provocative, and why not be provocative, I want to say, democracy hasn't worked for a lot of people. It just has not worked. And more than that, it seems often like a sham. It seems like a sham also because in many democracies, big businesses actually have an enormous amount of influence. Interest groups have an enormous amount of influence. So you get to a point where the small person, the so-called small person, wants to get revenge. They want to get revenge on what they call the system which alienates them. And, we shouldn't be here, I think, at least that's not my position. I don't think it is very productive to say, oh my God, these people don't, are idiotic, stupid, dangerous, hateful, etc. They have these feelings because, in many cases, they have been objectively betrayed. Not always. It depends on the country. It depends how exactly. This needs to be very much nuanced, but it has happened. So it feeds on the sense of alienation, on the sense of deep mistrust that people have developed. Then, I think in a situation of great economic uncertainty, alienation from the institution, the feeling that you are never seen, the feeling that nobody cares, and that the only people who have an impact are the powerful who have money anyway, then what happens, I think, is something like the only thing that I have is my culture and my identity. It is something, and that also is being taken away from me because I'm told to be tolerant of, for example, religion, which, in French case, for example, 150 years ago I was told that I needed to reject my religion in order to be fully democratic. And now, to be fully democratic, I have to accept religion, but a different one. So it's very confusing. It's very, do you understand what I mean? It's very confusing. I'm trying simply here to less, I'm trying to not put guilt, not to accuse, if you want, the populist. Some of them are guilty of hateful ideologies, absolutely, you know, neo-Nazis and so on and so forth. But I think a lot of people are struggling, and when they see Trump, somebody like Trump, which I find absolutely revolting, and I try to understand what do they see in such a revolting character. I think that what they see is somebody who carries their rebellion because they feel profoundly hateful for a system that has betrayed them. And they see, what they see is though somebody who is going to avenge them. And then I will be much, much shorter. That's the supply, if you want to look at the supply. But there is also a demand side. The demand side is that I think maybe parties changed. It comes from the top. Larry Bartels wrote a great book, which is called Democracy Arose from the Top. And the idea is that parties, especially right-wing parties, are actually trying all the time to kind of, they're trying to dismantle, or they are the ones who are trying to dismantle democracy, not people. They are the ones who invent narratives, who hire marketers to propagate lies and so on and so forth, like Trump. And so and they have connections to big business, like the brothers Koch, who have a very explicitly anti-green agenda that they are trying to put forward. So it comes from the top as well. It comes from, corrupt politicians who have alliances with a big business and who are really afraid of what is being asked from them, and who are actively trying to dismantle democracy to preserve their economic interests.
Yeah, other questions from the audience at this point? Yeah.
I would have a question that is twofold. First one is, is there a universal definition of populism? Could you agree if there is not the two of you on one definition? Secondly, based on that, what would be your outlook for European societies with background against populism, as we see it today? Thank you.
I didn't get the second question, sorry. What was the second question?
Outlook for European society.
Oh, okay. So the answer to the first question is, from my point of view, populism, no, I don't think populism is a universal concept. Because populism can mean many different things. And it's not inherently negative either. Right? So you also always need an adjective to sort of specify what kind of populism you mean, whether it's religious populism, whether it's nationalistic populism, chauvinistic populism, whatever. So there's also democratic populism too. So I think it's not universal, it has to be specified. And the outlook on the future of European societies, wow, that's quite a big task. But I don't really have the imagination to know what the future of European societies looks like. But what I can say is that I'm actually quite scared of what I even see today and how far we've already come. There has been an interesting opinion poll done by the Friedrich Foundation on how much right-wing thoughts, beliefs, and agendas have pushed forward into German society, even to the range of people who we would normally not categorize as right-wing people, so middle-class people, well-educated, etc. Even they incorporate this kind of thinking, right-wing thinking, sort of thing, you know, stereotypical views of racial views of others, conspiracy theories, and all this kind of stuff. And this is quite scary. Personally, I would have not thought that this would be possible. And I was always joking when my former colleagues, a very old professor, he had an American citizenship and German citizenship. And he would always go to Frankfurt to renew his American passport. He would take the train to go there to renew his American passport. We always ask him, why do you do that? This was like 10 years ago. And he would say, because you never know. I might have to flee the country.
He must have been a Jew.
No, he wasn't. No, that's the point. He wasn't. And that's, you know, he was born in the 1930s, so he actually sort of has some memory at least of that. And we were always kind of like, yeah, right. And I'm not sure, you know, he was so wrong. You know, we've come a long way, unfortunately.
So I wouldn't say there is a universal definition of populism. I would say there is a very minimalist one, which you must totally inflect and work on depending on the context. I would say that the very minimalist, the minimum condition for populism is the view of the purity of the people against corrupt elites. That, I think, would be a kind of core or minimal proposition that you find in many forms of populism, whether right-wing or left-wing. Now, with regard to the prospect of our societies, I'm never good about predictions. I think, and this goes back to something Simon said before about the virtues, or not the virtues, the emotional virtues of democracy. And here maybe there's going to be a gender inversion between us. Because all the virtues that you quoted, which is empathy and hope, and hope, yeah. These virtues are not in my opinion, are not virtues that enable you to defend yourself when you are attacked, especially when you're attacked from inside. And I think the greatest danger that democracies face today is that they don't really know how to defend themselves. In other words, they're not good fighters, because some of the virtues needed to fight are thought to be often anti-democratic. They're thought to be, and sometimes they are, anti-democratic. So, for example, tolerance. Tolerance is a very tough concept for democracies. It is, on the one hand, very crucial to a democracy, absolutely crucial. If you don't know how to accept difference, and even sometimes not only difference, but people who are opposed to you, then you are rejecting a fundamental principle of democracy. On the other hand, should you tolerate ideas that want to actively undermine you, who actively deny who you are? For example, let's say neo-Nazis in Germany. I don't know, I don't think so. I don't think so. At least that's a problem for democracy. So that's what I mean by the fact that democracies do not know very well how to defend themselves. And so if there is something that I think Europe should develop, it's precisely the question of how do we develop the tools, cognitive and emotional, to defend ourselves in a much more, I want to say, muscular way, without hurting the fundamental values that form who we are. So, for me, populism is like an autoimmune reaction. You know, it's like the body attacking itself in its desire to defend itself from all kinds of threats, real and imagined. what we need to develop is a defense that is not autoimmune. I mean, that's the metaphor that I wanted to offer.
Another question?
I'm interested, what would you say if someone comes up with radical counter-thesis to something you said?
Where are you coming
from? For example, that emotions and feelings have no place at all in democracy. Democracy means to let you leave emotions and feelings alone. Do not let them enter the political area. But democracy means that we are ready to bargain, to talk, to compromise, but we don't talk about our feelings. That's not democratic in any sense. The democratic man is a kind of a man without qualities, like Lucy would say, or like Richard Rorty said, is the ironic liberal who hasn't emotions to which orient him and which define him and all this identity stuff and all these things. Isn't it true that the democracy means reject not only religion, as you said, but reject your emotions. The emotions have no place in democratic politics because they are against that what's democracy about. Then they are against tolerance, they're against compromises, they're against bargaining, they're against counting votes. That's a very rational, very simple method. What we need emotions for? We count votes, and that's all.
Who wants to start? You have the mic.
Did we say that? Did we say anything like that?
That's what I was wondering.
He certainly kind of ignored what you said at the beginning.
So, did I get you right? You said, because we never said that democracy does not entail emotions. I actually said the exact opposite. So I'm not quite sure what the question really points to. If democracy, democracy has never been void of emotions, and if you read the classics, I think you don't need us emotion scholars to tell you that. There's classics like Alex de Tocqueville's on democracy, and he has a whole chapter on how emotional Americans get about their relation with democracy, how they sort of get energized by the fact that they have a vote and that their vote counts, etc., etc. So I think, as I said in the beginning, democracy is very much based on emotional attachment to the system, which of course also means that when the system is great, as Eva pointed out, people feel that they're being treated unfairly, the emotions can reverse, right? So they can also go against, feel alienated from democracy. But again, like, democracy is all about emotions, just like any group.
Yeah, so one last question.
So maybe going back to the point where we talked about people being scared again, your former colleague, I was thinking, what is your opinion on talked about the right-wing shift in Germany also, or in generally, of course, Europe, but the more established parties are more using populist rhetoric in their communication. So what would you say, what kind of democratic system are we going to have, or what kind of society are we going to be? It's also more established parties use that kind of rhetoric and kind of
so we have like a populism that is more used, or that, maybe let me rephrase that. So do we have a majority of people that are more used to populist rhetoric, so populism becomes kind of the norm? And yeah, will this be this big problem for democratic countries we will face in the future? Sorry for a very long question.
The question just seemed on Koschut, but both? Okay. Who wants to start?
Simon.
Yeah, I think if I got the question right, so in the sense of democracies being afraid or being...
No, more that people are more used to like populist rhetoric, because more established parties use that kind of rhetoric.
Okay.
As we've seen in Merz and also Austria, where the more established parties adapt these kind of right-wing populist policies. Yeah.
Right. So what I think what populism does really well, especially right-wing populism, is to shift the discourse in society towards their objectives. So in other words, and they use emotions to do that. So in many ways, you see this with many populist leaders in the world, the simple recipe that first you create the fear, and then you present the solution. Right? So you create this feeling of uncertainty, this feeling of anxiety among people, and then you present yourself as a solution, as a savior. And this is a very simple but extremely effective strategy that works extremely well in many ways. I think this is why populism, in many ways, especially right-wing populism, is so attractive to a number of people, because they tend to lack either the ability or the will to critically reflect on what populists are telling them, whether they actually have to be right, or whether they can actually do something themselves, or whether they have to rely on these populists to resolve their fears.
Can we do anything against them?
I'll leave that to you.
You don't want to answer?
No.
Okay. So maybe we need a glass of wine or beer or water for that. Thank you so much for being here, for participating in this discussion, and thank you to all of you for coming. And yeah, maybe we see each other next time when we have our colloquium on the 29th and 30th of November, where we rather talk about the interrelation, as Rahel already said, between these fears and resentment and racism. Thank you.